The sound of bone breaking echoes differently when 800 soldiers hear it at once. It carries across parade grounds and through morning air like a rifle shot, sharp and final, cutting through the low hum of military routine with surgical precision. For Captain Reese Kincaid, standing over Colonel Wade Thornhill as he crumpled to his knees clutching his shattered arm, that sound would define everything that came after. The silence that followed lasted exactly 7 seconds. 7 seconds of absolute stillness, where hundreds of pairs of eyes locked onto a scene that would rewrite careers, reshape policy, and force the United States Army to confront questions it had been avoiding for decades. But that moment, frozen in time and memory, was merely the explosion. The fuse had been burning for 12 months. 12 months earlier, March 2022 arrived at Fort Braxton with the kind of cold that settles into your bones and stays there the last gasp of winter, refusing to surrender to spring. Captain Reese Kincaid stepped off the transport bus with her deployment bag slung over one shoulder, her boots hitting North Carolina soil for the first time in 3 years. At 34, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned every ribbon on her chest the hard way. 2 tours in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq. 12 years of proving again and again that competence had no gender. Her father would have been proud. Would have been. Thomas Kincaid, who'd survived the frozen hell of the Korean War, only to succumb to delayed complications when Reese was 18, had left her with 2 things: an unwavering belief in service and a spine made of titanium. The Army had been her way of honoring his memory. Every mission completed, every life saved, every bridge built under fire was a conversation with a ghost, a promise kept to a man who never lived to see her in uniform. Fort Braxton sprawled before her like a small city, all function and purpose, where 80,000 souls moved in synchronized chaos. Somewhere in that organized machine, she would command the motor pool. Not the most glamorous assignment, perhaps, but one that mattered. Vehicles were the lifeblood of any military operation. Without them, the Army ground to a halt. And Reese Kincaid did not do half measures. The assignment brief had been clear: take over a motor pool running at 72% efficiency and fix it. Her predecessor had been reassigned after a pattern of equipment failures that nearly cost lives during a training exercise. Reese had 3 months to turn it around. She'd done harder things with less time. What the brief didn't mention was the new commanding officer who'd just been assigned to Fort Braxton. Colonel Wade Thornhill. The name meant nothing to her then. It would mean everything soon enough. She reported to base headquarters that afternoon, her dress uniform pressed to knife-edge precision, her bearing military perfect. The clerk at the front desk, a specialist who couldn't have been more than 22, directed her to the second floor. Colonel Thornhill's office. Protocol demanded she check in with the base commander within 24 hours of arrival. The hallway leading to his office was lined with photographs. Fort Braxton's history in black and white and faded color. Men in various uniforms, spanning decades, their faces serious, their eyes distant with the weight of decisions made and lives spent in service. Only men. The observation registered without judgment, simply fact. The military had been a masculine domain for most of its existence. That was changing slowly, stubbornly, against the current of tradition and the weight of culture. Reese knocked twice on the heavy oak door. A voice from within, clipped and authoritative, told her to enter. Colonel Wade Thornhill sat behind a desk that could have doubled as a landing strip, its surface almost aggressively organized. Every paper aligned, every pen in its place, the computer monitor angled precisely 90 degrees to the desk's edge. The man himself matched the environment, 55 years old, with silver threading through close-cropped hair, his uniform bearing the kind of perfection that came from 3 decades of habit. His face was weathered but strong, the kind of face that looked like it had been carved rather than born all sharp angles and hard planes. His eyes, when they met hers, were grady and cold as January. Captain Kincaid. Not a question, a statement. He didn't stand, didn't offer his hand. You're assigned to motor pool operations. Yes, sir. Reese remained at attention, her salute crisp and held until he returned it with minimum effort. Your predecessor left the unit in substandard condition. Thornhill leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled in front of him. I expect rapid improvement. This base doesn't tolerate mediocrity. Understood, sir. I've reviewed the efficiency reports and have a 90-day implementation plan too. I didn't ask for your plan, Captain. His voice remained level, almost pleasant, but the words landed like stones. I asked for results. You're dismissed. The meeting lasted less than 3 minutes. Reese saluted again, executed a perfect about-face, and left. Only later, walking across the base toward her new quarters, did the strangeness of the encounter settle in. She'd commanded operations in combat zones. She'd diffused improvised explosive devices with hands steady enough to thread needles. She'd earned commendations from generals and respect from soldiers who initially doubted her. And yet Colonel Wade Thornhill had looked at her like she was a problem waiting to happen. She shook it off. Some officers were like that, old school, all business. She'd won over harder men than him. What Reese couldn't have known that afternoon, was that 3 years earlier, Colonel Thornhill had sat on her promotion board. The board that determined whether Captain-Select Reese Kincaid would receive her railroad tracks or remain a first lieutenant indefinitely. The vote had been close. 2 in favor, 1 against. Thornhill's vote had been against his written justification buried in classified personnel files. Lacks command temperament, suitable for leadership in high-pressure environments. Recommend additional seasoning before promotion. 2 other board members had disagreed. Reese had made captain. But Thornhill's opinion hadn't changed. And now she was on his base under his command in a position where he could prove himself right. The motor pool complex sat on the eastern edge of Fort Braxton, a sprawling network of maintenance bays, equipment yards, and administrative buildings that hummed with constant activity. Humvees in various states of repair, transport trucks, with their hoods yawned open, the smell of diesel and grease and oil hanging in the air like perfume. It was a mechanic's cathedral, and Reese felt immediately at home. Sergeant Wyatt Brennan was waiting for her. 38 years old, 18 years in service, with hands that bore the scars of 1,000 repairs and shoulders that looked like they could carry twice his weight. He'd been running the motor pool in the interim between commanders, and his expression suggested he wasn't thrilled about relinquishing control. "Captain," he saluted without enthusiasm. "Welcome to the grease pit." "Sergeant Brennan." Reese returned the salute and extended her hand. He hesitated for just a moment before shaking it. His grip was firm testing. She matched it without trying to prove anything. "I've read your service record. Impressive. I'm going to need your expertise to turn this place around." Something shifted in his face. Not quite approval, but recognition that she'd done her homework. "Records say you did 2 tours in Afghanistan. EOD work. Explosive ordnance disposal, yes. And vehicle maintenance under combat conditions. I've rebuilt transmissions in 120-degree heat with mortars landing 200 yards out. I know my way around an engine." Brennan's eyes narrowed, reassessing. "We've got 15 mechanics, good men most of them. Equipment's old, budget's tight, and we're running about 70% operational readiness. Previous CO didn't prioritize maintenance schedules. 72% according to last month's report." Reese pulled out a tablet, called up the data. "But that's aggregate. Your heavy transport is at 85%. Your Humvee fleet is at 63. That's where we start." She spent the next 2 hours walking every bay, inspecting every vehicle, and asking questions that demonstrated she knew exactly what she was looking at. By the time the sun started its descent, Sergeant Brennan was answering with genuine respect instead of grudging compliance. The other mechanics, initially watching with skeptical eyes, began to warm incrementally. She didn't talk down to them. She didn't pretend to know more than them. She asked good questions and listened to the answers. By week 3, motor pool efficiency had climbed to 79%. By week 686, the mechanics started staying late, not because they were ordered to, but because they wanted to see how high they could push the numbers. Captain Kincaid had brought something the previous commander never had, a sense that their work mattered, that excellence was possible, that someone was paying attention. But while Reese was building loyalty among her soldiers, forces were aligning against her in ways she couldn't yet see. Colonel Thornhill received her weekly reports without comment. Her supply requisitions, which should have been approved within 48 hours, languished for a week, then 2. When she attended her first staff meeting, she noticed the way conversations stopped. When she entered, the way certain officers exchanged glances she wasn't meant to interpret. Major Garrett Aldridge, the deputy commander, was the only one who treated her like she belonged there. He'd served with her in Afghanistan, had seen her work firsthand, and his respect was genuine. "They're testing you," he told her, after one particularly tense meeting where her maintenance protocols had been questioned by 3 different officers despite their obvious effectiveness. "Thornhill's got his people. They're watching to see if you'll complain." "I don't complain," Reese said. "I document." And document she did. Every delayed requisition, every pointed question in staff meetings, every time her work was scrutinized more harshly than her male counterparts. She kept meticulous records, timestamps, witnesses. If this was going to turn into something, she'd be ready. September 2022 brought changes to Fort Braxton like weather rolling in from the coast. Colonel Thornhill, who'd been acting commander for 6 months, received his permanent assignment. The ceremony was all military pomp and circumstance speeches about leadership and tradition and maintaining standards. Reese attended because protocol demanded it, standing in formation with hundreds of other soldiers while Thornhill accepted command. His speech was 20 minutes of platitudes about honor and duty, but one line stood out. This base will not compromise its standards for political expediency. Excellence is not negotiable. Tradition is not expendable. The words themselves were innocuous. The way his eyes swept over the female officers present, lingering just long enough to make a point without making it explicit, was not. After the ceremony, Reese returned to her motor pool. She'd implemented a predictive maintenance system that used data analytics to prevent failures before they happened. The program had saved the Army an estimated $2 million in repair costs and lost operational time. She'd submitted the innovation through proper channels for consideration as a base-wide standard. The recommendation was rejected without explanation. Her supply requisitions, which had been merely slow before now, took 3 weeks to process. Her budget requests were cut. When she protested through proper channels, the response was always the same: limited resources, competing priorities, nothing personal. But it was personal. It had always been personal. October arrived with falling leaves and rising tension. Reese filed her first formal equal employment opportunity complaint. The process was careful clinical documenting patterns without accusations, presenting facts without emotion. She knew how the game was played. You didn't go after a full-bird colonel directly. You built a case, established a pattern, let the evidence speak. The complaint vanished into bureaucracy like water into sand. No response, no acknowledgement, just silence. Major Aldrich found her one evening after most of the base had gone home, sitting in her office surrounded by maintenance schedules and efficiency reports. He closed the door before speaking. "You need to be careful," he said without preamble. "Thornhill has connections at Division. He's been making calls. About me. About the motor pool. About standards. About whether certain assignments are appropriate for certain officers." Well, Aldrich chose his words carefully, dancing around what couldn't be said directly. "He's building a narrative." Reese set down her pen. "What kind of narrative?" "The kind where efficiency numbers are good, but leadership is questionable. Where innovation is really just deviation from established protocols. Where complaints about delayed requisitions are really just inability to work within resource constraints." Aldrich leaned against the desk. "He's going to inspect your operation, soon. And he's going to find problems." "There are no problems. My unit runs tighter than any motor pool on this base." "I know that. You know that. But he'll find something. He'll manufacture it if he has to." Aldrich met her eyes. "I'm telling you this because you're a good officer and you deserve to know what's coming." "Why would he do this?" "What have I done except my job?" "You've done your job too well. You've proven that the things he believes about women in leadership positions are wrong. That makes you dangerous. Not to the Army, to his worldview." Aldrich straightened. "Be ready. Document everything. And Reese, don't trust anyone in that inspection party. They'll all be his people." After he left, Reese sat in the darkness of her office for a long time. Outside, the motor pool was quiet except for the occasional clank of metal and the low hum of a generator. Her soldiers were gone home to families, to barracks, to lives beyond these walls. She'd sent them home early because they'd earned it, because efficiency bought you that luxury. She thought about her father, about the stories he'd told of Korea, of the cold and the caisson and the brotherhood formed in fire. He'd never talked much about the politics of it, the why behind the war. He talked about the men beside him, about doing the job right, about honor that had nothing to do with flags and everything to do with the person looking back at you from the mirror. "Stand tall, Reese," he'd told her once when she was 16 and dealing with a teacher who insisted girls couldn't excel in advanced physics. "Don't let anyone make you smaller to fit their limited imagination." She hadn't then. She wouldn't now. The next morning, Reese arrived at her office to find an envelope on her desk. No return address, no marking, just a plain manila envelope sealed with tape. Inside was a USB drive and a note written in block letters: "He's planning to force you out. Be careful." She stared at it for a full minute before sliding the drive into her computer. What she found made her blood run cold. Audio recordings. 4 of them dated over the past 6 weeks. Colonel Thornhill's voice unmistakable in its clipped authority, speaking with other officers. The conversations were damning. "I need Kincaid gone before she makes major. Can't set that precedent. Her efficiency numbers are problematic. Makes it harder to justify certain decisions. The inspection will take care of it. We'll find violations. There are always violations if you look hard enough. Women in combat roles ruin unit cohesion. This social experiment needs to end." The recordings were clear professional quality, obviously made by someone with access to Thornhill's office. Someone who disagreed with him enough to risk their career exposing him. Someone who remained anonymous, protected by deniability. Reese played them 3 times, taking notes, verifying timestamps. Then she made 2 copies, encrypted them, and stored them in separate secure locations. One went to her personal legal counsel. One she kept. The original stayed on the drive, sealed back in the envelope locked in her desk. Then she called Major Aldridge. They met off base at a coffee shop in Fayetteville, where military personnel rarely ventured. Aldridge listened to the recordings through earbuds, his face growing harder with each word. When they finished, he removed the earbuds and sat in silence for 30 seconds. "This helps," he said finally. "But it's not enough. Not yet. We need him to cross a line publicly." "What line?" "The one between being a difficult CO and being a criminal." Aldridge leaned forward. "These recordings prove bias. They prove intent, but they don't prove action. Not the kind that would force Division's hand. We need him to do something so egregious, so public, that they can't sweep it under the rug. You're asking me to let him come after me. I'm asking you to be ready when he does. And Reese, he will. The inspection is scheduled for March 15th, 4 months from now. He's coordinating with sympathetic officers to ensure they find problems. He wants an audience." "What kind of audience?" "Morning formation. The entire battalion on the parade ground right next to your motor pool. He wants to make an example of you. Public humiliation followed by administrative action. By the time anyone realizes what happened, you'll be reassigned to some nowhere posting and he'll have proven his point." Reese felt something cold settle in her chest. Not fear, anger, the quiet, focused kind that didn't explode but instead compressed into diamond-hard resolve. "Then we give him what he wants," she said. "Let him come. Let him inspect. Let him try to tear apart my operation in front of witnesses. Because Garrett, my motor pool, is going to be so perfect, he won't find a damn thing wrong with it. And when he manufactures violations anyway, when he crosses that line, those soldiers are going to see exactly who he is. That's a hell of a risk. It's the only play we have. He's got the power, he's got the connections, but he doesn't have the truth. And eventually that matters." She met his eyes. "Doesn't it?" Aldridge didn't answer immediately. Finally, he nodded. "I'll make sure someone from the Inspector General's office is there, disguised as a regular soldier. They'll witness everything. Don't tell me who. I don't want to know. I need to believe I'm doing this alone." Over the next 4 months, Captain Reese Kincaid transformed her motor pool from excellent to immaculate. Every tool found its place. Every procedure was documented. Every soldier knew their role with such precision they could execute it in their sleep. Efficiency climbed to 98%, a number that should have been impossible with their aged equipment and limited budget. She also did something else. She ordered a body camera, the kind of civilian police wore, and she wore it every day. The regulations were murky on personal recording devices, existing in a gray area between security concerns and personal protection. She didn't advertise it, but she wore it. Every interaction, every meeting, every moment on duty was captured and encrypted and backed up to secure servers off base. If Thornhill was going to come for her, she would have evidence. Private Liam Fletcher joined her unit in January, fresh from mechanics school and terrified of everything. 22 years old, from some small town in Pennsylvania, with hands that shook whenever a senior officer addressed him directly. Most commanders would have cycled him out, sent him somewhere he wouldn't be under pressure. Reese saw something else. She saw a kid who knew engines the way musicians know instruments, who could diagnose problems by sound alone, whose hands steadied the moment he touched tools. So she worked with him. Patient instruction, calm guidance, building confidence brick by brick. By March, Private Fletcher had become one of her best mechanics. Still nervous around brass when standing at attention, but competent and increasingly confident when working. He looked at Captain Kincaid with the devotion of someone whose potential had been recognized instead of dismissed. Sergeant Brennan, who'd started as a skeptic, had become her fiercest advocate. "I've served under 15 different officers," he told the other mechanics one evening when they thought Reese couldn't hear. "Captain Kincaid is the best. She gives a damn. That's rarer than you'd think." The culture in her motor pool had shifted from grudging compliance to genuine pride. They weren't just maintaining vehicles. They were proving something. They knew what was coming. Word traveled in the military faster than official communications. Everyone knew Colonel Thornhill was planning something. Everyone knew Captain Kincaid was his target. And everyone who worked for her had decided without formal discussion or vote that they would stand with her when it happened. March 14th arrived like a held breath. Tomorrow was the inspection. Tomorrow was the confrontation. Tomorrow, everything changed. Reese stayed late that evening, walking through empty maintenance bays, running her hands over equipment that gleamed under fluorescent lights. Everything was ready, perfect, unassailable. And she knew with absolute certainty that it wouldn't matter. Thornhill would find fault because he needed to find fault. The inspection was theater. The conclusion was already written. But the audience wasn't. Witnesses would see how this played out, and that Reese thought might be enough. She called her mother that night. Sarah Kincaid, 78 years old and sharp as ever, listened to her daughter's carefully edited version of events. "You sound like your father before deployment," Sarah said quietly. "Calm. Too calm. What's really happening, Reese?" "I have a difficult CO. It's going to come to a head tomorrow." "Difficult how?" "The old-fashioned kind of difficult, Mom. The kind that thinks women belong in support roles, not command positions. The kind that's going to try to prove I don't belong." Silence on the other end. "Then your father used to say that courage isn't not being afraid. It's being terrified and doing the right thing anyway. Are you afraid?" "Yes." "Good. Fear keeps you sharp, but don't let it make you small. You've earned your place. Remember that." After the call, Reese sat at her desk and wrote a letter. Old-fashioned pen on paper sealed in an envelope addressed to Major Garrett Aldridge. The instructions were simple: to be opened only if I'm court-martialed or worse. The letter contained everything: the USB drive recordings, documentation of every delayed requisition, every biased interaction, every piece of evidence she'd accumulated. Her testimony written while she could still write it freely. Insurance legacy, proof. She locked it in her desk's bottom drawer, then went home to try to sleep. She didn't sleep. Instead, she lay in darkness, staring at ceiling shadows, thinking about the moment her father had given her his Korean War service medal. She'd been 17 a year before he died, already talking about military service, despite his reservations. "This medal doesn't mean what you think it means," he'd said, pressing the cold medal into her palm. "It's not about heroism. It's about showing up when showing up was hard, about doing your job when your job was impossible, about standing when everyone else wanted to run. That's what service is, Reese. The choice to stand." Tomorrow she would stand. The morning of March 15th dawned cold and clear, the kind of morning where sound carried and vision stretched forever. Reese, dressed in her uniform with ceremonial care, every crease perfect, every button, aligned her ribbons, a rainbow testament to years of service. The body camera was clipped to her belt, small and unobtrusive, already recording. She arrived at the motor pool at 0600 hours, 2 hours before the scheduled inspection. Her soldiers were already there, all 15 of them, checking and rechecking equipment that didn't need checking, cleaning what was already clean. Nervous energy crackled through the air like static electricity. "Listen up," Reese called them to attention. They gathered in a semicircle, these men who'd become something more than subordinates. "Whatever happens today, whatever you see or hear, maintain your bearing. Stay professional. Let your work speak for itself. This motor pool is the best on base. You've made it that. Nobody can take that away. Understood?" "Yes, ma'am." The response was sharp, unified, defiant. At 0745 hours, soldiers began forming on the parade ground adjacent to the motor pool. Morning formation, standard procedure, nothing unusual. Except today, those hundreds of pairs of eyes would have a clear view of the motor pool entrance. Today, morning formation had an ulterior purpose. Reese watched them assemble through her office window. Row after row of soldiers in perfect alignment, their faces forward, their bearing military exact. Somewhere in those ranks was the Inspector General's investigator. Somewhere in those ranks were allies she didn't know she had. And somewhere in those ranks were people who agreed with Thornhill, who thought she didn't belong, who would cheer her downfall. She checked her body camera one final time. Recording. Battery full. Cloud backup active. At precisely 0800 hours, Colonel Wade Thornhill's vehicle pulled up to the motor pool entrance. The fuse had burned down to nothing. The explosion was about to begin. Colonel Wade Thornhill emerged from his vehicle with the bearing of a man who had never questioned his own authority. His uniform was pressed to razor sharpness, his posture military perfect, despite 55 years of gravity. Behind him, 6 junior officers spilled out of a second vehicle, their faces carefully neutral, their notebooks already open. An inspection party, an execution squad dressed in army green. Reese stepped out of her office to meet them, her salute crisp and held until Thornhill returned it with mechanical precision. No warmth in his eyes, no acknowledgement beyond what protocol demanded. "Colonel, motor pool ready for inspection, sir?" "We'll see about that, Captain." His voice carried across the open space, loud enough for nearby soldiers to hear, loud enough for the formation on the parade ground to catch fragments. This was intentional. Everything about this moment was choreographed. The inspection began with administrative records. Thornhill and his officers crowded into Reese's small office, pulling files, examining maintenance logs, scrutinizing every piece of documentation with the intensity of men looking for treasure or evidence. Reese stood at attention, answering questions with facts, providing context where needed, her voice level and professional. 30 minutes in, they'd found nothing. Her records were immaculate. Every vehicle accounted for, every maintenance cycle documented, every safety protocol followed to the letter and beyond. She could see frustration building in Thornhill's face, a tightness around his eyes, a compression of his lips. He'd expected easy targets. He'd expected sloppiness that could be magnified into incompetence. Instead, he was finding a unit that ran like precision machinery. "Let's inspect the vehicles," he said abruptly, standing so quickly his chair scraped against concrete. "That's where problems hide. Not in paperwork, in actual operations." They moved outside the inspection party, fanning out across the motor pool like a search team. Soldiers on the parade ground watched with growing interest. Morning formation should have started already, but someone had delayed it. Someone wanted those soldiers watching. The first bay held 5 Humvees in various stages of maintenance. Thornhill approached the nearest one, running his hand along the hood, checking for dust that wasn't there. He peered into the engine compartment, looking for oil leaks or loose connections, or any sign of mechanical neglect. Nothing. The vehicle was immaculate. He moved to the second Humvee, then the third. Each time the same result. These machines were maintained with the kind of care that spoke to pride and work to soldiers who gave a damn. "This wrench," Thornhill pointed to a tool resting on a workbench. "It's 3 inches out of position according to the tool shadow board." Reese glanced at the shadow board on the wall where the outline of every tool was painted, so mechanics knew exactly where each item belonged. The wrench was indeed slightly offset from its designated position. "Yes, sir. Sergeant Brennan was using it 5 minutes before your arrival. Standard protocol allows tools to be off-shadowed during active maintenance periods. They're returned to position at end of shift." "I didn't ask about protocols, Captain. I asked about standards. If a wrench can be out of place, what else is out of place?" It was a nothing violation, the kind of nitpick that would never be noted in a normal inspection. But this wasn't a normal inspection. They moved through 3 more bays. Thornhill found a paint touch-up that was allegedly the wrong shade, a lubricant log that had an entry from yesterday instead of this morning, a parts inventory that listed items by serial number in ascending order instead of alphabetical order by item name. Each finding was technically accurate. Each was also meaningless. These were not safety violations, not readiness issues, not anything that affected the motor pool's 98% operational efficiency. They were pretext. The junior officers in Thornhill's party dutifully wrote down each observation, their pens scratching against paper with sounds that felt like accusations. Some looked uncomfortable. Others seemed eager, sensing blood in the water. Reese maintained her composure, responding to each criticism with calm explanations, offering to correct issues immediately, never arguing, but never conceding that these minor deviations represented actual problems. Her body camera captured everything. Every word, every expression, every moment of this theater. They reached the 4th bay where Sergeant Wyatt Brennan was overseeing a transmission rebuild. Brennan snapped to attention as the inspection party approached his mechanics, following suit. 18 years of service had taught him how to read officers, and what he read on Thornhill's face made his jaw tighten imperceptibly. "Sergeant, explain this maintenance procedure." Thornhill gestured at the disassembled transmission. Brennan launched into a detailed technical explanation, his voice steady, his knowledge absolute. The procedure he described was textbook perfect, incorporating improvements from recent Army technical bulletins. He spoke with the confidence of a man who knew his craft. Thornhill listened with the expression of someone waiting for a mistake. When Brennan finished, the colonel's response came like a slap. "That's not how we did it when I was working on vehicles. Your method wastes time, valuable time that could cost lives in a combat situation." "Sir, with respect, the method Sergeant Brennan describes is current doctrine. It actually saves time in the long run by preventing recurring problems. We have data showing data." Thornhill's voice dripped contempt. "I have 32 years of experience, Captain." "That trumps your data." The junior officers shifted uncomfortably. One of them, a major named Patterson, opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. Whatever he'd been about to say died unspoken. They moved to the 5th bay. Private Liam Fletcher was there, working on an engine rebuild, his tools organized with obsessive precision, his movements careful and methodical. At 22, he still got nervous around senior officers when standing at attention, and the arrival of the inspection party made his shoulders tense visibly. Thornhill zeroed in on that tension like a predator spotting weakness. Private, are you nervous because you're incompetent or because you know you're about to be discovered? Fletcher's face went white. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The young soldier's eyes darted to Reese, pleading for rescue. Sir Private Fletcher rebuilt 18 engines this month with 0 defects. Reese kept her voice measured but firm. His nervousness stems from being in the presence of senior officers during an inspection, not from incompetence. Once he's working, his hands are steady as a surgeon's. Did I ask for your assessment, Captain? Sir, or as his commanding officer, you're responsible for this disaster of a motor pool. Thornhill's voice rose, carrying clearly now beyond the bay walls. Soldiers on the parade ground heard those words. Hundreds of witnesses to what was becoming less an inspection and more an inquisition. Fletcher stood frozen, his face cycling through emotions, fear, confusion, shame. He was 22 years old and had done nothing wrong except be nervous. And now his commanding officer was being publicly berated for defending him. Sergeant Brennan took a step forward, his face hard. Other mechanics in the bay stopped working, attention shifting from engines to the drama unfolding in their midst. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees with rising tension. Thornhill turned his attention fully to Reese, now abandoning all pretense of inspecting equipment. This had always been about her. The motor pool was just the battleground. Captain Kincaid, your incompetence endangers American lives. This unit under your command fails to meet the standards of the United States Army. Sir, our operational readiness is 98%. That's the highest on base. Our maintenance protocols exceed. I don't care about your numbers. Numbers can be manipulated. I care about real readiness. And what I see here is a unit that cuts corners, that prioritizes appearance over substance, that lacks the discipline necessary for combat operations. Every word was calculated, every accusation designed to wound while remaining just vague enough to avoid specific rebuttal. But Reese had played this game before in different contexts with different antagonists. She knew the pattern, the escalation, the baiting. Sir, I respectfully request we continue this discussion in private. I can provide detailed documentation. Private, so you can run to your equal employment opportunity friends, so you can cry about how unfairly you're being treated. Thornhill's voice climbed another notch. No, Captain. This ends now. This ends here. He turned to address the mechanics scattered throughout the bay. 15 soldiers who had spent months under Reese's command, who knew exactly what kind of leader she was, who understood that what they were witnessing had nothing to do with motor pool efficiency. How many of you, Thornhill asked, his voice echoing off concrete walls, how many of you have requested transfers out of this unit because of Captain Kincaid's leadership? Silence. Complete absolute silence. Not one hand moved, not one soldier spoke. They stood at attention, their eyes forward, their faces carefully blank, but their stillness was its own answer. No one wanted to leave. No one had complained. This unit, despite everything, was exactly where they wanted to be. The refusal to validate his accusations seemed to snap something in Thornhill. Color rose in his face, a flush spreading from collar to hairline. He'd expected compliance. He'd expected at least one soldier to raise a hand to give him the opening he needed. Instead, he'd received unified silence that spoke louder than any words. Sergeant Brennan, Thornhill spun on the senior NCO. You've served 18 years. You've seen real leadership. Tell me honestly, is Captain Kincaid the kind of officer you'd follow into combat? Brennan didn't hesitate. His voice carried the weight of conviction earned through experience. Sir, I've served under 15 different officers in my career. Captain Kincaid ranks in my top 3, maybe top 1. She leads by example. She knows the work because she does the work. Every man here would follow her anywhere, sir. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Brennan had just contradicted his commanding officer in front of witnesses. Career suicide normally. But the sergeant's face showed no regret, only determination. Thornhill's face darkened further. Sergeant, you're relieved of duty pending investigation of your judgment and fitness for your position. Then relieve me too, sir. One of the mechanics, a corporal named Hayes, took a step forward. Because I agree with Sergeant Brennan. And me, another mechanic. Me too, a third. Within seconds, all 15 mechanics in the bay had stepped forward, forming a loose line between Thornhill and Reese. Not threatening, not aggressive, just present, standing, refusing to let their captain face this alone. It was mutiny. Not in the traditional sense, not refusing orders or abandoning posts, but a collective statement that transcended protocol. These soldiers were declaring through position and presence whose leadership they trusted. And it wasn't the colonels. The situation was spiraling beyond Thornhill's control. What should have been a simple inspection, followed by administrative action, had become a public confrontation with battle lines drawn. Soldiers on the parade ground were watching now without pretense. They'd abandoned formation to crowd closer to see and hear what was happening. Officers were supposed to stop them, restore order, but even the officers seemed paralyzed by the unprecedented nature of what was unfolding. Thornhill's hands clenched into fists. His breathing came shallow and rapid. Every muscle in his body radiated barely contained fury. He'd spent 4 months planning this moment, coordinating with sympathetic officers, manufacturing justifications, and it was all collapsing because soldiers refused to cooperate with their own commander. Captain Kincaid, his voice dropped to something quieter but infinitely more dangerous. This is what happens when we let diversity hires command soldiers. This is what happens when political correctness overrides military readiness. You are a walking example of lowered standards. The accusation cut through the bay like a blade. Diversity hire. The implication was clear. She hadn't earned her position. She was there to fill quotas to satisfy politicians, to make the Army look progressive, regardless of actual competence. Reese felt something cold settle in her stomach. Not fear, not shock. She'd heard variations of this accusation her entire career, sometimes whispered, sometimes shouted, always carrying the same message: you don't belong. But this time was different. This time it was on record. This time hundreds of soldiers heard it. This time there could be no walking it back, no claiming, misunderstanding, no bureaucratic burial. Sir, her voice remained level despite the adrenaline flooding her system. I am formally filing a sexual harassment complaint. Multiple witnesses present. Your comments constitute discrimination based on gender and are in direct violation of harassment. Thornhill's laugh was harsh and ugly. You want to see harassment? He grabbed the inspection clipboard from one of his officers and hurled it. Not at Reese, but at the ground near her feet, where it clattered and skidded across concrete. Papers scattered like frightened birds. Pick it up. Not a request, a command. Pick it up, Captain. That's an order. The bay went absolutely still. Every soldier understood what was happening. This wasn't about the clipboard. This was about power, about forcing submission, about making Reese kneel literally or figuratively to prove his authority over her. Reese looked at the scattered papers, looked at Thornhill, looked at the hundreds of soldiers watching from the parade ground. Multiple recording devices captured it all: the thrown clipboard, the order, the context that made it something far more than a simple directive. Sir, I will not comply with an order I believe to be unlawful and inappropriate. That's insubordination. Add it to your growing list of failures. Private Fletcher, who'd been standing frozen this entire time, couldn't take it anymore. The young soldier's voice cracked as he spoke. Sir, please. Captain Kincaid has done nothing wrong. She's the best officer I've ever... Shut your mouth, Private. Thornhill moved toward Fletcher with sudden violence, closing the distance in 3 quick steps. His hand came up, not yet striking, but the threat implicit in the motion. Fletcher stumbled backward, nearly tripping over his own tools. Reese's training kicked in before conscious thought. 12 years of combat operations, of threats assessed and neutralized, of split-second decisions that meant life or death. She moved between Thornhill and Fletcher, placing herself physically as a barrier, her body language defensive, but her presence absolute. Sir, step back. Thornhill's hand was still raised, frozen in mid-motion. For a moment, 3 full seconds, they stood like that. The colonel's hand suspended in air, Reese between him and the young private, hundreds of soldiers holding their collective breath. And then Thornhill's hand moved. The motion was fast, driven by fury and frustration, and 4 months of planning gone wrong. His palm swung toward Reese's face in what could charitably be called an aggressive gesture and realistically described as an attempted strike. Whether he meant to actually hit her or just intimidate her would be debated later. In the moment, it didn't matter. Reese's body responded with muscle memory encoded through thousands of hours of training. Her eyes tracked the incoming hand. Her brain calculated trajectory, velocity, threat level. Her conclusion formed in microseconds: imminent, assault response, authorized, neutralized threat. She moved with precision that came from expertise rather than thought. Her hands shot up, intercepting Thornhill's wrist with both palms. Her grip locked around the joint fingers, finding pressure points with anatomical accuracy. She pulled his arm forward, using his own momentum against him, while simultaneously stepping back and rotating her torso 45 degrees. The technique was textbook Krav Maga, the Israeli combat system taught to military personnel for close quarters self-defense. Applied correctly, it redirected an attacker's force, used their body weight against them, and created joint locks that controlled without requiring superior strength. Applied correctly, it also caused pain, significant pain. Reese continued the motion, pulling Thornhill off balance while twisting his wrist beyond its natural range of motion. The colonel, expecting to make contact with her face, found himself suddenly moving forward with nothing to stop his momentum. His body tilted. His feet scrambled for purchase that wasn't there. And then came the sound. The crack of breaking bone carried across the motor pool bay with crystalline clarity, a sharp report that momentarily drowned out every other noise. Thornhill's radius snapped cleanly 2 inches above the wrist, the bone giving way under combined forces of torque and leverage and basic physics. The colonel's face transformed from rage to shock in an instant. His legs gave out. He dropped to his knees, cradling his right arm against his chest, his mouth open in a perfect O of pain and disbelief. No sound came out for 3 full seconds. Then a groan low and animal forced its way through his throat. Reese released his wrist immediately and stepped back to a position of attention, her hands at her sides, her face professionally neutral. The entire sequence from Thornhill's aggressive motion to his collapse had taken less than 4 seconds. 4 seconds that hundreds of soldiers witnessed. 4 seconds captured on body cameras, smartphone videos, and the recording devices of an inspector general's investigator who stood somewhere in that crowd. 4 seconds that would change everything. The silence that followed stretched impossibly long. 1,000 people frozen in tableaus of shock, their faces reflecting various stages of processing what they'd just seen. The base commander on his knee's arm broken by a captain he'd been inspecting. The physics of it were simple. The implications were catastrophic. Then sound returned like a wave. Gasps, murmurs, the rustle of hundreds of soldiers shifting position, turning to neighbors, seeking confirmation that they'd really seen what they thought they'd seen. Sergeant Brennan moved first, dropping to one knee beside Thornhill. Combat medic training overrode everything else. He examined the arm without touching it, noting the angle, the swelling already beginning the way Thornhill cradled it. "Sir, you need medical attention. Don't move the arm. I'm calling for an ambulance." Thornhill's eyes, when they focused on Brennan, were glazed with pain and something else. Humiliation. Defeat. The understanding that whatever he'd planned, however he'd imagined this morning unfolding, it had gone catastrophically wrong. His voice, when he managed to speak, was thick with effort. "Arrest her. Arrest Captain Kincaid. Assault on a superior officer. She attacked me." "Sir, with respect, that's not what happened." Major Garrett Aldridge materialized from somewhere, moving through the crowd of mechanics with purpose. "I witnessed the entire incident. Captain Kincaid was defending Private Fletcher from your aggressive advance. When you moved to strike her, she employed defensive techniques. She did not initiate contact. I don't care what you witnessed. I'm giving you an order, Major. Arrest that woman." Aldridge looked at Reese, his face carefully composed. "Captain, I'm going to need you to come with me, not under arrest, for your protection and to preserve the integrity of what's going to be a very complicated investigation." Reese nodded. "Yes, sir, I'll cooperate fully." "Sir," one of the junior officers in Thornhill's inspection party, a lieutenant colonel named Morrison, stepped forward. "Sir, we need to get you to the hospital. And sir, I have to advise you that anything you say right now could be problematic. You should wait for legal counsel." The concern in Morrison's voice wasn't for Thornhill's well-being. It was for his legal exposure. Smart officers could see the writing on the wall. This wasn't going to be a simple assault charge against a subordinate. This was going to be an investigation into what led to that moment. And the hundreds of witnesses on the parade ground complicated any narrative Thornhill might try to construct. The base ambulance arrived within minutes, medics hustling through the crowd with practiced efficiency. They immobilized Thornhill's arm, administered pain medication, loaded him onto a stretcher with careful movements that still drew hisses of pain. As they wheeled him toward the ambulance, his eyes found Reese one last time. The hatred in that gaze was pure and absolute. This wasn't over. Not for him. Even broken, even beaten, even facing an investigation that could end his career, Colonel Wade Thornhill was already planning his next move. Reese walked beside Major Aldridge toward base headquarters, her bearing military perfect, despite what had just happened. Behind them, the soldiers who'd witnessed everything slowly dispersed, but not before many pulled out phones to text, to call, to share what they'd seen. The story was already spreading beyond Fort Braxton's gates, carried on digital wings to social media platforms and news outlets and military message boards. Within an hour, videos would surface. Smartphone footage from a dozen angles showing Thornhill's aggressive advance, his raised hand, Reese's defensive response the moment of breaking. The quality would be shaky, the audio sometimes unclear, but the essential truth would be obvious to anyone watching. A commanding officer had attacked a subordinate. The subordinate had defended herself. And the Army was about to have a very public conversation about power abuse and the cost of speaking truth to authority. Reese was placed in a conference room at headquarters, not locked, but under guard. Standard procedure for someone involved in an incident requiring investigation. Aldridge had brought her water, a notepad, and advice delivered in a quiet voice. Write down everything, every detail from the moment you arrived this morning to the moment his arm broke. Timeline. Quotes as close as you can remember them. Witnesses. Evidence. Everything, Reese. Because they're going to come at you with everything they have. Thornhill has allies, officers who think like him, who believe the military is better off the way it used to be. They'll try to spin this as insubordination, as a subordinate attacking a superior. They'll ignore context. They'll minimize his behavior. They'll make you the villain. But there are witnesses, hundreds of them, and half of them will be pressured to remember it differently, or to suddenly become uncertain about exactly what they saw, or to decide it's not worth risking their careers over. Aldridge met her eyes. You're about to learn how the system protects its own, even when its own doesn't deserve protection. What about the IG investigator you mentioned? Aldridge's expression flickered with something that might have been satisfaction. Already filing a report, but even that won't make this simple. You broke a full-bird colonel's arm, Reese. That's not something the Army takes lightly, justified or not. She spent the next 6 hours writing every conversation with Thornhill from her arrival at Fort Braxton, every delayed requisition, every pointed comment in staff meetings, the USB drive recordings, which she'd already turned over to Aldridge, the pattern of behavior that led to this morning, the inspection itself minute by minute, Fletcher's fear, Brennan's defense, the 15 mechanics standing together, Thornhill throwing the clipboard, the order to pick it up, his advance on Fletcher, the raised hand, the defensive response. Her hands cramped from writing, but she didn't stop. This was her testimony. Her version before it could be shaped or edited or contradicted. The truth documented while it was still fresh. Outside the conference room, Fort Braxton churned with activity. The base commander was in surgery to set his broken arm. The inspector general's office was interviewing witnesses. The public affairs office was being inundated with media requests. And in barracks and dining facilities across post, soldiers were having urgent conversations about what they'd seen and what it meant. Some supported Reese. She'd defended herself and a subordinate from an abusive commander. She'd done exactly what they trained for. Assess threats, respond, proportionally protect the vulnerable. Others were horrified. She'd struck a superior officer, broken his arm, shattered the chain of command, set a precedent that could lead to chaos if subordinates thought they could use violence against commanders they disagreed with. But the vast majority of those witnesses fell somewhere in between. They understood that what they'd seen was complicated, that Thornhill had been wrong, but Reese's response had been extreme, that both things could be true simultaneously, that he'd provoked the confrontation, and that she'd ended it with force that, while arguably justified, carried consequences. Neither of them could escape. As afternoon turned to evening, Reese remained in that conference room, writing and waiting. Her recording devices had been seized as evidence. Her phone was taken. She was isolated alone with her thoughts and her testimony, and the growing certainty that her career, regardless of how this investigation ended, would never be the same. The door opened. Major Aldridge entered, carrying coffee and a sandwich she hadn't asked for but desperately needed. Preliminary witness statements are in. Out of 812 who were present, 647 are saying Thornhill was the aggressor. 92 are saying you attacked unprovoked. The rest claim they didn't see clearly enough to say. 647. Reese let the number sink in. That's more than I expected. It's overwhelming. But Reese, it won't be enough to stop this from going to court-martial. You're going to be charged. And so is he. Dual prosecution. U.S. versus Captain Kincaid and U.S. versus Colonel Thornhill. Simultaneous trials or possibly combined. She took a sip of coffee, felt it burn going down, welcomed the sensation of something real and immediate. How long until charges are filed? 72 hours probably. Maybe sooner if pressure from above accelerates things. Pentagon's involved now. This is national news. Female officer breaks commanding officer's arm after public confrontation. Every outlet is running with it. Different spins, different angles, but everyone's talking about Fort Braxton today. So what happens now? Now, Aldridge set his own coffee down and looked at her with something approaching sympathy. Now it gets worse before it gets better. Now the lawyers start crafting narratives. Now your life gets picked apart by people who've never served, never faced a situation like you faced, never had to make a split-second decision with hundreds of people watching. Now you learn that justice and the law are related but not identical. And now, Captain Reese Kincaid, you prepare for the fight of your life. Reese finished writing her statement as night fell over Fort Braxton. The last lines were simple, direct, true. I do not regret defending myself and Private Fletcher. I followed my training. I used proportional force. I acted in accordance with my oath to protect those under my command. If faced with the same situation, I would make the same choice. I am a soldier. I did my duty. She signed it, dated it, and handed it to Aldridge. Outside, hundreds of soldiers were trying to sleep, replaying what they'd seen, wondering what would come next. Somewhere in a hospital room, Colonel Wade Thornhill lay with his arm in a cast, planning his revenge and his defense. And across America, people were reading headlines and watching videos and forming opinions about a confrontation they didn't fully understand. But in that conference room, Reese Kincaid felt something unexpected. Not fear, not regret, relief. The tension of 12 months, the weight of knowing conflict was coming, the exhausting effort of staying professional under systematic assault, all of it released in 4 seconds of decisive action. She'd stood up. She'd fought back. She'd broken more than just bone. She'd broken the silence, the pattern, the cycle of abuse that relied on victims staying quiet. Whatever came next, she'd face it with resolve, the way her father taught her. So part by rewrite that chinfai numdium. Part 3, Justice and Reckoning Revised. The machinery of military justice moves with deliberate precision, grinding slowly but comprehensively, leaving nothing unexamined in its wake. For Captain Reese Kincaid, the 72 hours following the confrontation passed in a blur of interrogations, legal consultations, and enforced isolation that felt more like quarantine than protection. She was confined to quarters, allowed contact only with her appointed defense counsel and Major Aldridge in his official capacity as witness coordinator. The rest of Fort Braxton continued its operations around her, but she existed in a bubble of legal limbo, waiting for charges that everyone knew were coming. They came on the 4th day. Formal notification delivered by a stone-faced captain from the Judge Advocate General's office, reading from a document with the clinical detachment of a coroner announcing cause of death. Captain Reese Kincaid was hereby charged under Article 128 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice with assault on a superior commissioned officer. Maximum penalty, dishonorable discharge, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, in 10 years confinement. The same day, in a hospital room across base, Colonel Wade Thornhill received his own notification. Multiple charges: assault under Article 128, conduct unbecoming an officer under Article 133, conspiracy to violate rights under Article 93A, and creating a hostile work environment. Maximum combined penalty: dismissal from service, forfeiture of all retirement benefits, and 18 months confinement. The Army, facing unprecedented public scrutiny and pressure from Congress, had decided to prosecute both. Let a court-martial sort truth from accusation. Let military justice demonstrate its impartiality. Let the evidence speak louder than the competing narratives already fracturing public opinion. The media firestorm exceeded anything Fort Braxton's Public Affairs Office had prepared for. Within 24 hours of the incident, smartphone videos had circulated to every major news outlet. Cable networks ran the footage on loops, freeze-framing the moment Thornhill's hand moved toward Reese, the instant her defensive technique engaged the crack of breaking bone. You could almost hear through shaky video compression. Conservative commentators decried the breakdown of military discipline. Progressive voices hailed Reese as a hero standing up to systemic abuse. Veterans groups split along generational and ideological lines, their debates growing heated in social media threads and cable news panels. The story had everything modern media craved: institutional power dynamics, gender politics, military culture, clash, and dramatic video evidence. Hashtags proliferated. Hashtag Stand With Kincaid trended alongside hashtag military discipline and hashtag justice for Thornhill. Think pieces flooded editorial pages. Legal analysts debated self-defense doctrine on morning shows. The confrontation at Fort Braxton became a Rorschach test, revealing more about observers' pre-existing beliefs than about the actual event. Through it all, Reese remained silent. Her defense counsel, Colonel Janet Holloway, was a 52-year-old JAG officer with a reputation for aggressive advocacy and zero tolerance for bureaucratic intimidation. She'd built her career defending soldiers accused of crimes in combat zones, navigating the murky intersection of warfare and law, and she'd never lost a case where evidence supported her client. She took one look at the body camera footage, the witness statements, and Thornhill's documented pattern of harassment and told Reese something unexpected. "We're not just defending you, we're putting the system on trial." The legal strategy was audacious. Holloway planned to argue that Reese's actions weren't merely justified self-defense, but the inevitable result of institutional failures that forced her into an impossible situation. The Army had ignored complaints, enabled harassment, and created conditions where violence became the only language Thornhill understood. By prosecuting Reese while simultaneously prosecuting Thornhill, the military was admitting both officers had legitimate grievances, which meant the system itself bore responsibility. "They want this to be about one bad colonel and one defensive captain," Holloway explained during a strategy session in her office, surrounded by law books and case files stacked like fortifications. "We're going to show them it's about decades of cultural rot that your confrontation finally exposed. Every delayed requisition, every ignored complaint, every female officer who was forced out rather than fight back. All of it becomes evidence." The investigation expanded rapidly. Inspector General teams descended on Fort Braxton like archaeological excavators, carefully brushing away layers of accumulated cover-up to reveal the fossils of institutional bias beneath. What they found was damning. 7 other female officers had filed complaints about Thornhill over 5 years at 3 different postings. Every complaint had been dismissed, downplayed, or resulted in the complainant being reassigned to career dead positions. The pattern was unmistakable. Thornhill targeted competent women, undermined their authority, and was protected by sympathetic senior officers who shared his worldview. One of those 7 women, Major Diana Westbrook, had left the Army entirely after Thornhill engineered her removal from a battalion command position. She'd been replaced by a less qualified male officer whose primary credential was not threatening Thornhill's conception of proper military hierarchy. Westbrook, now working as a defense contractor, agreed to testify. So did 4 of the other 6. Their stories varied in specifics, but shared common themes: competence, questioned work, scrutinized beyond standard professional isolation, and ultimate retaliation when they pushed back. The prosecution, led by Major William Rutherford, faced a challenge unlike any he'd encountered in 15 years as a JAG prosecutor. His case against Reese should have been straightforward. She'd broken a superior officer's arm. Physical assault on a commissioned officer was among the most serious offenses in military law, designed to preserve the chain of command that held military structure together. But the video evidence was problematic. Thornhill's aggressive advance, his raised hand, the defensive nature of Reese's response, and those hundreds of witnesses, most of whom would testify that Thornhill was the aggressor. Rutherford's strategy became clear during pretrial motions: focus on the technical aspects of the law while minimizing context. Yes, Thornhill had been inappropriate. Yes, he'd created a hostile environment. Bisouas. Those were separate issues requiring separate adjudication. But Reese had used force against a superior officer, and regardless of provocation, that force violated the Uniform Code of Military Justice. The law was the law. Exceptions couldn't be made even for sympathetic circumstances without undermining the entire foundation of military discipline. It was a defensible position, legally sound, morally complicated. The court-martial convened in May 2023, 2 months after the confrontation held in Fort Braxton's largest courtroom, to accommodate the unprecedented media and public interest. The military judge was Colonel Marcus Stone, a 30-year veteran with a reputation for strict adherence to law, tempered by genuine concern for justice. 2 additional officers completed the panel: Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Vickers, who'd served in Iraq and Afghanistan, and Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Bradford, an armor officer with minimal combat experience but extensive legal training. The courtroom packed beyond capacity. Media representatives filled designated press seats, their laptops and recording devices, creating a technological hum beneath formal proceedings. Military lawyers from across the JAG Corps attended to observe what many considered a landmark case. And in the back rows, as many of Reese's soldiers as could get leave sat in uniform, their presence a silent statement of support. Reese entered wearing her dress uniform, every ribbon precisely placed, her bearing confident, despite the charges that could end her career in freedom. She'd lost weight during the 2 months of investigation, the stress carving away anything non-essential, until only determination remained. Her mother sat in the family section, 78 years old but ramrod straight, her eyes fierce with protective anger. Sarah Kincaid had raised her daughter to stand tall. Now she would watch that daughter face judgment for doing exactly that. Thornhill arrived in civilian clothes, his right arm still casted the injury, a visible reminder of why they were all assembled. His lawyers had advised against uniform, arguing that appearing as a wounded officer might generate sympathy. He looked diminished, somehow smaller than he'd seemed during the inspection, his authority stripped away, leaving only a middle-aged man facing consequences. The prosecution's opening statement was clinical. Major Rutherford outlined the charges established that Reese had indeed caused Thornhill's injury and argued that military discipline required accountability, regardless of circumstance. His tone was respectful toward Reese, acknowledging her service record, while insisting that good soldiers who made bad choices still face justice. Captain Kincaid's career prior to March 15th was exemplary, Rutherford told the panel. Her service in Afghanistan and Iraq demonstrated courage and competence. But on March 15th, she made a choice. When faced with a difficult situation, she chose violence. Not de-escalation, not withdrawal, not any of the numerous nonviolent options available to her. She chose to physically assault her commanding officer, breaking his arm, and ending any possibility of resolving their professional differences through proper channels. The law is clear. Assault on a superior officer is a crime. Captain Kincaid committed that crime. The circumstances may be mitigating. They are not exculpatory. Holloway's opening statement was a declaration of war. She spent 20 minutes detailing Thornhill's pattern of harassment, presenting evidence of delayed requisitions and ignored complaints, and arguing that the Army had created the very situation it now sought to punish Reese for escaping. Colonel Thornhill didn't inspect Captain Kincaid's motor pool on March 15th. Holloway stated, her voice carrying to every corner of the courtroom. He executed a premeditated plan to destroy her career, a plan he'd spent months developing, a plan that violated every principle of leadership and honor this uniform represents. Captain Kincaid didn't assault him. She defended herself and her soldiers from an officer who'd gone beyond inappropriate conduct into criminal behavior. The prosecution wants you to focus on 4 seconds of physical contact while ignoring 12 months of systematic abuse. That's not justice. That's complicity. The trial proceeded with the measured pace of military legal proceedings, each witness examined and cross-examined each piece of evidence, scrutinized from every angle. The body camera footage was played repeatedly, analysts offering frame-by-frame breakdowns of movement and intent. Medical experts testified about the nature of Thornhill's injury, confirming that the break pattern was consistent with a defensive redirection of force rather than an offensive attack. The angle and location of the fracture told a story Reese had controlled and neutralized a threat, not initiated violence. Private Liam Fletcher testified with visible nervousness, his voice cracking as he described Thornhill's intimidation and Reese's protection. Under cross-examination, Rutherford tried to establish that Fletcher had misinterpreted Thornhill's intent, that the colonel was merely conducting a demanding but appropriate inspection. Fletcher didn't budge. "Sir, I know what an inspection looks like. I know what harassment looks like. What Colonel Thornhill did that morning wasn't about checking if we maintained vehicles properly. It was about humiliating Captain Kincaid in front of hundreds of soldiers. And when she wouldn't be humiliated when she defended me from his anger, he tried to hit her." Sergeant Wyatt Brennan's testimony was devastating to the prosecution. 18 years of service gave him credibility that couldn't be impeached, and his assessment of both officers was unequivocal. Thornhill had conducted the inspection in bad faith, looking for violations that didn't exist, escalating when he couldn't find justification for his predetermined conclusions. Reese had maintained professional composure until the moment Thornhill's behavior crossed from verbal abuse into physical threat. "I've served in combat zones, sir," Brennan told the panel. "I've seen soldiers make split-second decisions under fire. Captain Kincaid did exactly what we're trained to do: identify a threat and assess options, respond with minimum necessary force. If that had been an enemy combatant moving aggressively toward her, nobody would question her response. The fact that it was her commanding officer doesn't change the physics or the justification." The 7 women who'd previously filed complaints against Thornhill testified over 3 days, their stories painting a portrait of an officer who used rank as a weapon against subordinates he deemed unsuitable. Major Diana Westbrook, whose testimony was expected to be impactful, proved even more powerful than anticipated. She described in clinical detail how Thornhill had manufactured a command climate assessment that portrayed her as divisive and ineffective, despite objective performance metrics showing the opposite. When she'd filed a complaint, the investigating officer had been one of Thornhill's longtime associates. The complaint was dismissed as personality conflict. 6 months later, Westbrook was reassigned to a logistics desk job that effectively ended her operational career. "I had 2 choices," Westbrook told the courtroom: keep fighting and watch my career die slowly, or resign with some dignity intact. I chose resignation. Captain Kincaid chose to fight. I wish I'd had her courage. But then came a moment no one had anticipated. As Holloway prepared to call her next witness on the trial's fourth day, a woman in civilian clothes stood from the gallery seats. "Your Honor, permission to approach." Colonel Stone, surprised but intrigued, granted permission. The woman walked forward with the bearing of someone who'd made a difficult decision and committed fully to it. "I'm Captain Rebecca Hale. I resigned my commission 18 months ago because of Colonel Thornhill." Her voice carried clearly steady despite obvious emotion. "I filed complaints. They were buried. I was told to be grateful for my career and stop making trouble. So I left. But I'm not leaving this courtroom until everyone knows what he did." Before Stone could respond, 5 more women stood. Different ages, different ranks, some still in uniform, others in civilian clothes, all wearing the haunted look of people who'd fought battles no one acknowledged. "We're the ones who stayed silent," one said, a lieutenant colonel who still served. "Captain Kincaid is the one who fought back. We're here to make sure her fight wasn't for nothing." The courtroom erupted. Media scrambled for cameras. Judges called for order. And Thornhill, watching ghosts from his past materialize to testify against him, seemed to age 10 years in 10 seconds. Stone restored order after a full minute of chaos. "Captain Hale, you're not on the witness list. Neither are these other officers. However, given the extraordinary nature of this development, I'm going to allow preliminary statements. Colonel Holloway, you'll have 24 hours to prepare these witnesses properly." What followed was 3 days of testimony that expanded the case from individual grievance to systemic indictment. 12 women total, spanning 5 years and 3 military installations, all targeted by Thornhill, all failed by the complaint system, all forced to choose between careers and dignity. Their collective testimony created an undeniable pattern. This wasn't about personality conflicts or misunderstandings. This was about an officer who'd spent years weaponizing his authority against women he considered unsuitable for military service, protected by a network of sympathetic officers who'd buried complaints and retaliated against complainants. Rutherford's cross-examination of these witnesses focused on establishing that their experiences, while regrettable, were separate from the assault charge against Reese. Pattern evidence of Thornhill's behavior might be relevant to his trial, but it didn't excuse physical violence against him. The law against assaulting superior officers existed precisely to prevent subordinates from taking justice into their own hands when they felt mistreated. "Major Westbrook, did you ever strike Colonel Thornhill?" "No, sir." "Did you break any superior officer's arm?" "No, sir." Yet you managed to maintain your career for 6 additional months and eventually resign on your own terms. So physical violence wasn't necessary for you. Why was it necessary for Captain Kincaid? The question hung heavy. Holloway objected, arguing that the situations were incomparable, but the point had been made. Other officers had endured Thornhill's harassment without resorting to violence. What made Reese different? The answer came during Reese's own testimony. She took the stand on the trial's 9th day, her composure absolute despite knowing that every word would be analyzed, weaponized, or defended depending on perspective. Holloway led her through a chronological account: arrival at Fort Braxton, initial meeting with Thornhill, the pattern of obstruction and harassment, the USB drive evidence, the inspection itself, and finally those 4 seconds that changed everything. "Walk us through your decision-making in that moment," Holloway requested. "Colonel Thornhill's hand was moving toward you. What were you thinking?" Reese's answer was precise, unemotional, the testimony of a soldier trained to articulate tactical decisions. "I assessed 3 factors simultaneously. First, Colonel Thornhill had just shoved Private Fletcher, establishing his willingness to use physical force. Second, his hand was moving on a trajectory toward either my face or Private Fletcher behind me. Third, his body language and elevated stress indicators suggested he wasn't in control of his actions. Given those factors, I concluded that physical contact was imminent and potentially harmful. My training dictates that in such situations you don't wait to be hit. You neutralize the threat using minimum necessary force." "Could you have stepped away?" "Negative. Private Fletcher was directly behind me. Stepping away would have exposed him to Colonel Thornhill's aggression." "Could you have verbally de-escalated?" "I attempted verbal de-escalation multiple times during the inspection. Colonel Thornhill was beyond reach of verbal intervention. His actions demonstrated that." "So in that moment, with Private Fletcher behind you and Colonel Thornhill's hand moving toward you, what were your options?" "Except being struck, which would have demonstrated to hundreds of watching soldiers that abuse of authority was acceptable, or defend myself using the techniques I was trained to employ, I chose defense." Rutherford's cross-examination was surgical. He forced Reese to admit she had Krav Maga training, that she knew her techniques could cause injury, that she chose to apply a wrist lock known to be painful and potentially damaging. He established that Thornhill, at 55, and with no recent combat training, posed less physical threat than enemies she'd faced in Afghanistan. He questioned whether her response was truly proportional or whether it reflected accumulated frustration seeking outlet. Captain Kincaid, isn't it true that you were angry at Colonel Thornhill? Yes, sir. Angry about the delayed requisitions, the difficult inspections, the professional obstacles. Yes, sir. And when his hand moved toward you, didn't that anger influence your response? Didn't you perhaps unconsciously welcome the opportunity to physically strike back at someone who'd been making your life difficult? Reese met his eyes directly. Sir, if I'd wanted to hurt Colonel Thornhill, I could have done far worse. My training includes techniques that would have resulted in permanent disability or death. I chose a wrist lock that neutralized the immediate threat with minimal injury. The break was unfortunate, but not intentional. I used exactly the amount of force necessary to protect myself and Private Fletcher. Nothing more. The answer was good, but couldn't fully dispel the question. Had accumulated harassment primed Reese to respond with more force than absolutely necessary, the panel would have to decide. The prosecution's case against Thornhill was, if anything, even more damning. The USB drive recordings were played in full, his voice clear and unequivocal in its bias. The pattern of complaints and his response to them demonstrated systematic abuse of authority. Character witnesses called to support him were few, and their testimony lukewarm. Officers who should have defended him instead offered carefully worded statements that praised his long service while avoiding endorsement of his leadership style. The most damaging testimony came from Major Patterson, one of the junior officers who'd accompanied Thornhill on the inspection. Patterson had initially submitted a statement supporting Thornhill's version of events, but under oath and facing perjury charges if he lied, his story changed. He admitted that Thornhill had briefed the inspection party beforehand, telling them to find violations regardless of actual conditions. He acknowledged that the colonel's behavior during the inspection was inappropriate and that Thornhill had initiated physical aggression. His voice shook as he explained that he'd lied initially because he feared career retaliation. I was wrong, Patterson said. I should have stopped him. I should have said something when he threw that clipboard when he went after Private Fletcher. But I was afraid, and my cowardice allowed the situation to escalate until Captain Kincaid had no choice but to defend herself. The trial consumed 3 weeks, generating thousands of pages of transcript and countless hours of testimony. Legal analysts debated fine points of self-defense doctrine, military lawyers argued about precedent and policy, and across America, people watched a system struggle to balance competing values, hierarchy versus justice, tradition versus evolution, institutional protection versus individual rights. The panel deliberated for 48 hours behind closed doors, 3 officers wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. The law was clear, but its application was complicated. Both Reese and Thornhill had violated regulations. Both had justifications. Both believed themselves right. How did you weigh systematic harassment against physical assault? How did you balance Thornhill's 32 years of service against his pattern of abuse? How did you evaluate Reese's split-second decision against the sanctity of military hierarchy? On May 28th, the panel returned with verdicts. The courtroom was silent enough to hear breathing as Colonel Stone read from the findings. His voice was steady, but his expression suggested the weight of what he was announcing. In the case of United States versus Captain Reese Kincaid on the charge of assault on a superior commissioned officer, we find the defendant not guilty. The courtroom erupted. Spectators gasped, applauded, shouted objections. The judge's gavel cracked like thunder, restoring order after 30 seconds of chaos. Reese remained standing at attention, her face showing no emotion despite the relief flooding her system. Her mother in the family section covered her mouth with both hands, tears streaming. Stone continued reading. The panel finds that Captain Kincaid's actions constitute lawful self-defense under Article 128. Her response to Colonel Thornhill's aggressive advance was proportional, necessary, and executed in protection of herself and Private Fletcher. Military rank does not grant immunity from assault, nor does it obligate subordinates to accept physical abuse. Captain Kincaid is fully exonerated and restored to duty without prejudice. The statement was clear, comprehensive, and would establish precedent for future cases. The military was formally acknowledging that hierarchy had limits, that self-defense transcended rank, that competent officers could not be targeted for traits unrelated to performance. The panel's findings regarding Thornhill were equally unequivocal. Guilty on all charges. The evidence of systematic harassment, abuse of authority, and conspiracy to violate rights was overwhelming. His injury, while regrettable, was the direct result of his own criminal behavior. The panel recommended maximum punishment, dismissal from service, forfeiture of all pay and retirement benefits, and 18 months confinement. Thornhill's face as the verdict was read cycled through disbelief, rage, and finally hollow acceptance. His career was over, his reputation destroyed, his retirement gone. Everything he'd built over 32 years collapsed in minutes because he couldn't accept that competence had no gender. The judge added a final statement before dismissing the court. This trial has exposed systemic failures in how the military addresses harassment and discrimination. Captain Kincaid should never have been forced into a situation where physical self-defense became necessary. The fact that she was represents institutional negligence. This court recommends comprehensive review of complaint procedures, mandatory implicit bias training for all officers, and independent oversight of discrimination investigations. We must do better. The courtroom emptied slowly, spectators reluctant to leave a moment they recognized as historic. Reese was surrounded immediately by her defense team, her mother, Major Aldridge, and several of her soldiers who'd attended the trial. Sergeant Brennan gripped her hand without words, his expression saying everything necessary. Private Fletcher, who'd grown substantially in confidence during the trial, saluted her with parade ground precision. Outside the courthouse, media swarmed, shouting questions and thrusting microphones toward anyone associated with the case. Holloway had prepared a brief statement on Reese's behalf, thanking the panel for their courage and calling for the policy reforms the judge had recommended. Reese herself said nothing, walking to her vehicle surrounded by a protective cordon of soldiers who'd served under her command. The aftermath unfolded rapidly. Within 72 hours, the Secretary of the Army announced the Kincaid Protocols, a comprehensive reform package addressing the systemic issues exposed by the trial. All discrimination complaints would now be investigated by independent review boards with no connection to the accused's chain of command. Retaliation against complainants became a criminal offense with mandatory minimum punishment. Implicit bias training became required annually for all officers, and whistleblowers received protections so robust that career retaliation became virtually impossible. The 12 women who testified about Thornhill's harassment were all offered reinstatement or redress. 7 accepted various forms of compensation or career adjustments. 5 had moved beyond military careers and declined, but they appreciated the acknowledgement that they'd been wronged. Major Westbrook, watching the verdict from her civilian office, felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight 4 years. Vindication, even delayed, mattered. Reese was promoted to major in a ceremony held on the Fort Braxton parade ground where hundreds of soldiers had witnessed the confrontation. The promotion was both recognition of her performance and symbolic statement that the Army valued competence over compliance. She was immediately assigned to the Pentagon, where she would help implement the Kincaid Protocols across all service branches. From victim of the system to architect of its reformation, her trajectory demonstrated how individual courage could catalyze institutional change. 6 months after the trial, Fort Braxton dedicated a ceremony renaming the motor pool complex. It became the Captain Reese Kincaid Motor Pool Excellence Center, a permanent reminder of what had happened there and why it mattered. Reese attended, uncomfortable with the honor, but understanding its symbolic importance. Her former soldiers, still running the motor pool with exceptional efficiency, treated the event like a homecoming. They'd stood with her when it mattered. Now they shared her victory. But Reese also insisted on another recognition. At the same ceremony, a memorial plaque was dedicated to Private Liam Fletcher and Sergeant Wyatt Brennan, honoring their courage in standing up during the confrontation. Private Fletcher is now Chief Warrant Officer Fletcher, Reese announced at the dedication, gesturing to the young man who stood at attention nearby, his nervousness replaced by quiet confidence. He graduated top of his class from Advanced Mechanics School and now commands his own maintenance unit. When asked about that March morning, he tells his soldiers the same thing every time: protecting people is more important than protecting your career. That lesson was worth everything. She turned to Brennan, who'd retired after 22 years, but accepted a civilian position as senior instructor at Fort Braxton's motor pool training facility. Sergeant Brennan makes sure every new mechanic hears the story of the day 15 soldiers stood together. He tells them leadership isn't about rank. It's about doing what's right when doing what's right costs you something. The crowd applauded both men, recognizing that Reese's vindication was incomplete without acknowledging those who'd stood beside her. The dedication ceremony drew hundreds of attendees, many of them the same soldiers who'd witnessed the original confrontation. They stood at attention as Reese addressed them, her voice carrying across the parade ground, just as it had that morning 18 months earlier. "This facility isn't named for me because I broke someone's arm," she said, dispensing with prepared remarks and speaking from the heart. "It's named for everyone who refused to stay silent, when staying silent was easier. For Sergeant Brennan, who defended me when it was career risk. For Private Fletcher, who found courage when he was terrified. For the 15 mechanics who stood together when standing apart would have been safer. For hundreds of you who witnessed truth and refused to let it be buried, you made justice possible. This is your legacy. The applause that followed was sustained and genuine, hundreds of pairs of hands, creating sound that echoed off buildings and carried across Fort Braxton's grounds. They weren't just applauding Reese. They were applauding themselves, celebrating their own role in changing a system that had seemed immovable. 1 year after the confrontation, Reese received a letter. Standard envelope, no return address, postmarked from a federal correctional facility in Kansas. She opened it with some trepidation, unsure what communication from that source could contain. The letter was handwritten, 2 pages in careful script, signed at the bottom by Wade Thornhill. Major Kincaid. It began using her new rank. I have spent 12 months in confinement, contemplating the choices that brought me here. The Army provided a psychiatrist who helped me understand that my treatment of you and others stemmed from fear. Fear that the military I understood was changing in ways I couldn't control. Fear that competent women like you would expose the mythology. I'd built my identity around that masculine aggression, equaled leadership, that tradition mattered more than effectiveness, that rank justified any behavior. The letter continued, detailing his realization that he'd harmed not just individual officers but the institution he'd claimed to serve. He acknowledged that his harassment had made the military weaker, not stronger. That true discipline came from respect freely given, not submission coerced through fear. You were the better soldier, Thornhill wrote in conclusion. Better leader, better officer. I spent 32 years in uniform, but you understood service in ways I never did. Your courage in standing up to me and defending your soldiers, in refusing to be diminished, that's what leadership looks like. I'm sorry for the pain I caused you and the others I targeted. I can't undo the damage, but I can acknowledge the truth. You belonged. You always belonged, and I was wrong to suggest otherwise. Reese read the letter twice, looking for insincerity or hidden agenda, finding only what appeared to be genuine contrition. She didn't respond. Some wounds heal, some don't, and communication wasn't necessary for either outcome. But she kept the letter filed in a drawer with other documents from that period. Acknowledgement without absolution. Recognition without reconciliation. 2 years after the confrontation, the Kincaid protocols had been implemented across all military branches. Discrimination complaints were down 30%, not because discrimination had vanished, but because effective procedures prevented situations from escalating to crisis points. Retaliation incidents dropped by 60%. And the number of female officers in command positions increased by 23%, as talented women who might have left rather than fight found an institution more willing to recognize their competence. Reese, now Lieutenant Colonel Kincaid, following an accelerated promotion, continued her work at the Pentagon while mentoring young officers navigating the challenges she'd faced. Her office became something of a pilgrimage site for women dealing with difficult command climates, seeking advice from someone who'd survived the worst the system could inflict and emerged not just intact, but triumphant. One afternoon, a young captain named Jennifer Moss knocked on Reese's office door. 26 years old, West Point graduate, currently fighting a harassment complaint against her battalion commander that was going nowhere through official channels. She'd read about Kincaid's case, studied the trial transcripts, and traveled to the Pentagon hoping for guidance. Reese gave her 45 minutes and a strategy that would ultimately result in her commander's removal. Document everything, Reese told her, echoing advice she'd once received. Stay professional even when they're not. Use the Kincaid protocols. That's what they're for. And remember, you're not fighting for yourself alone. You're fighting for every woman who will come after you. That matters. That's worth the cost. Were you scared? Moss asked as their meeting concluded. When you knew the confrontation was coming, Reese considered the question. Honesty felt important. Terrified. Every day for months. But my father once told me that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's being terrified and doing the right thing anyway. That wisdom carried me through, and it'll carry you through too. The young captain left with renewed determination, carrying guidance from someone who'd walked the path before her. This, Reese thought, was how culture changed. Not through grand declarations or policy documents, but through individual courage multiplied across thousands of interactions until the exceptional became expected and the impossible became routine. 3 years after the confrontation, on a cold March morning, similar to the one where everything changed, Reese returned to Fort Braxton for a speaking engagement. The base had continued its operations, its population cycling through as soldiers deployed and returned and moved to new postings. But institutional memory persisted. New arrivals were told the story of Captain Kincaid, shown the motor pool that bore her name, taught that standing up to abuse wasn't just permitted but expected. She stood on the same parade ground where hundreds of soldiers had watched her defend herself, where witnesses had refused to stay silent, where a moment of violence had catalyzed systemic reform. The ground looked the same, the buildings unchanged, but everything was different. A formation of soldiers stood at attention listening as Reese delivered a lecture on leadership that had nothing to do with tactics or strategy and everything to do with character. She talked about service, about the choice to stand between danger and those who need protection. She talked about the mechanics who'd stood with her when standing meant risk. She talked about the cost of silence and the necessity of speaking truth even when truth was dangerous. Service, she concluded, means standing between danger and those who can't defend themselves. That danger might be enemy soldiers on a battlefield, or it might be abusive authority in your own institution. Either way, your job is the same. Stand, fight, protect. That's what we wear this uniform for. The soldiers applauded, but Reese barely heard it. She was looking at the motor pool entrance, remembering a moment 3 years past when choice and consequence had merged in 4 seconds of decisive action. She'd stood, she'd fought, she'd broken bone and precedent in the silence that enabled abuse. And she'd do it again, without hesitation, without regret. Because some battles had to be fought regardless of cost, because integrity demanded it, because the hundreds of witnesses and all the women who'd come before her and all who'd come after deserved nothing less than complete uncompromising courage. The parade ground emptied slowly as soldiers returned to duty. Reese remained a moment longer, feeling March wind that carried memories like voices, hearing echoes of breaking bone and collective gasps and a judge's gavel declaring justice served. Then she turned and walked toward her vehicle, shoulders back, head high, every inch the soldier she'd always been. Behind her, Fort Braxton continued its eternal rhythm. Ahead of her, new challenges waited. But in that moment, walking across ground made sacred by courage, Lieutenant Colonel Reese Kincaid felt something profound. Peace. The fight was over. Justice had won. And the choice to stand, made in a moment of crisis 3 years ago, had created ripples that would continue long after she was gone. She'd done what her father taught her. She'd stood tall when standing tall was hardest. And that, in the end, was what service meant.